Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us in studio, we have Kaplan, co-founder and co-CEO of Promethium, to discuss regulation in the digital asset space. It is great to have you with us, Aaron. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thank you for having me, Jill.
Give us a high-level overview of what Promethium does and how does it fit into the current regulatory atmosphere?
Sure. Promethium is a fintech company creating a public market and custodial infrastructure for our subsidiaries Promethium ATS and Promethium Capital. Promethium ATS has obtained the regulatory licenses to operate a public ATS, and Promethium Capital, another one of our subsidiaries, is currently in the process of obtaining the regulatory licenses to operate a blockchain custodian, what's called a special purpose broker-dealer. And what that will allow is for us to custody digital asset securities and also settle digital asset transactions that occur on our ATS.
Interesting. You can do it all in one space. You don't have to segment it out to different areas.
I think that the idea is that the universe of Promethium will be vertically integrated. What you'll allow is for the creation, distribution, trading of either a primary digital asset, a newly created, or an existing digital asset, and the ability to clear, settle, and custody those digital assets, all compliantly under the federal securities laws.
What are your thoughts around regulation in the digital asset space as it stands now?
I think what's been very apparent is that the current or the previously used regulatory frameworks were deficient, and that there needs to be more stringent regulatory frameworks applied to the digital asset space. I think in the recent market downturn, investors were really left holding the bag, particularly public investors, the retail public. And the goal of regulation, particularly securities regulation in the United States, is to protect the investment public, to ensure fair, orderly, and efficient markets and promote capital formation. And I think the implementation of those standards and those investor protections are really necessary for the space to avoid these things that have happened previously.
Right, well, they have to determine, is it a security or not? I think that's one of, when you think about where we're headed, what does that look like?
I would argue that digital assets have always been securities, and it's just a question of how they've been transacted previously. If you follow Chairman Gensler's comments, what he said is that many digital assets are securities. Virtual currency exchanges should register with the SEC or under the securities rules, and that they're operating as unregistered broker-dealers. So if you take that online, it's pretty clear that regulation is coming. And it's coming at a more rapid pace given the recent events and the significant downturn that's happened over the previous quarters.
What about legislation? Is it going to be fresh legislation or revamping what is currently in place?
That's an interesting question. I think that legislation is a long, difficult, and arduous process. I think the securities laws were created as a result or in response to the market crash of 1929. And the goal was to ensure there wasn't excessive leverage, to make sure that there was basically no commingling of customer funds and securities, and that there were institutional controls. And I think that those securities laws, after that you had the Securities Act of 33 and the Exchange Act of 34, and those become the cornerstones of securities regulation, which is really meant to protect investors. So I think it's now just a question of implementing those frameworks and laws on the space to make sure that the public is protected.
Right, so let me ask you this, could stricter regulation have avoided the current digital asset blowups that we saw? Because at the end of the day, a lot of it was so severely over-levered.
Oh, incredibly.
I mean, that can happen with any asset class, not just digital assets.
Operating in a gray environment.
Right, right.
If you have regulations like Reg T that basically limit the amount of leverage you could take, and you basically have other regulations like the Customer Protection Rule, which is 15C33, which is a segregation of customer funds and securities from that of the institution, you would prevent a lot of what occurred. Now, obviously, there was major speculation in the space, over-speculation, but at the same time, the lack of institutional controls and the resulting sort of debacles and destruction of an incredible amount of paper wealth made it very clear that one, regulation is necessary, the existing frameworks didn't work, and that investors need to be protected.
Yeah, well, it's somewhat counterintuitive to the philosophy behind digital assets where you want it to be decentralized. It's going to have to require a framework, and we'll have somewhat of a centralized component to it. Is the industry ready to adopt that?
I don't know if it's the industry's
choice. Really, yeah.
Essentially, the goal of the federal securities laws, the SEC, the government in general, is to protect the investment public here. And crypto, in that sense, had gotten so big that it presents potential systemic failures, systemic issues. And in order for people to be protected, make sure that the retail investor doesn't lose the majority of their wealth in some sort of wipeout event, you need to have the protections that are ensured by the federal securities laws.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to think of a silver lining, of course, having significant paper wealth destroyed is devastating for anyone. But coming out of this crypto winter, bear market, whatever you want to call it, those outliers have been shaken out, and legislators are forced to deal with this. So when do you realistically anticipate crypto to be treated as a security?
I think it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. I think what we'll see is that entities like Promethium will be building infrastructure like we have, and with the intention of launching a public market for digital assets in Q4 for ourselves. And the idea there is to treat digital asset securities, or digital assets that qualify as securities, compliantly under the federal securities laws. And the federal securities laws, again, I want to hammer this home, they've been tried and tested over almost 100 years. We don't need to create something new. History has repeated itself. Let's avoid it again.
Yeah, well, that's a great point that you make, Aaron. Appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. Thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.